In this lesson, we're going to do a coding exercise about NGRX store actions. NGRX store provide us two creator functions to generate actions, the createAction and createActionGroup function. And we're going to use those functions in this lesson to generate actions. Now, usually when I teach about APIs, I think it's better and more recommended to actually do the exercise by writing code. So that's why I'm teaching APIs by writing code. APIs are not the main focus. They're something that you do after you understand technology. APIs also change from version to version. So that's why my preference is to teach about APIs, like creating actions, teaching those functions by you writing code. And you don't have to open your IDE, or you don't have to start a new Angular application. You can actually do this exercise from your browser. So in academies.com, EN course Angular NGRX actions, you'll find the coding exercise in our site. And you can actually write the code in the site. So if you scroll down, you see an explanation about the student exercise. And here you can modify the code and write and solve the exercise. And you also have the solution underneath. So you can also see what you need to create. We will create in this lesson a small app that fetches a list of GitHub repositories. So we are going to use some sort of API here. So you see the solution here, and you can go over the files for the solution. But before you go over the solution, try to do it yourself. Try to write the code and solve the exercise yourself. This is one exercise about the createAction function. And there is another exercise about the createActionGroup function. Same drill here. You can write the code here, and you get the solution underneath. So we can see what you can do, what you need to do, and also you have the solution, the code solution. But before, try to solve it yourself. So in this lesson, we're going to focus on coding exercise to learn how do we create actions in NGRX store. So before starting to write code, let's talk about what are actions. Actions are used to alert the NGRX store that something happened in our application. We are sending those actions using a function on the store service called store dispatch. So we need to dependency inject the store service, and then we can use the store dispatch and send the action to the store to alert the store that something happened in our app. The store dispatch is going to take that action and will send that action to the reducers. Now, the reducers can decide if they are going to respond to that action by changing the state. So often, after we call store dispatch with an action, we often cause a change of the state. Actions contain a name, so each action has a unique name, and optional additional data is also attached to an action. Now, the API of actions, we will talk in this lesson about two creator functions. One function called createAction, which will be our first coding exercise, is to use createAction to create our action, basically. CreateAction creates a single action. Later, we'll do another exercise where we talk about another function, createActionGroup, which allows you to create multiple actions, which is, I think it should be more used today than the create actions, because usually we create a group of actions. But we'll start this exercise by creating one single action using the createAction function. Now, the first, let's see an example of the code. The first argument of createAction is the name of the action. Now, notice that usually we take actions and we group them together in a group. And usually the name of the group relates to the reducer that responds to those actions. So in this example, we might have a books reducer, and all the actions that relate to that books reducer are going to be prefixed with square brackets and books. This signifies that they belong to a group called books. Now, it's a good convention. It's not a must, but it has two benefits. One, actions need to have a unique identifier. So putting them in a group will most likely prevent you from actually taking one action name and accidentally repeating that name in a different action. Also, the second benefit of it, it's after you use the Redux dev tools, it feels much more understandable and organized if you can actually see the actions that happen and understand which groups do those actions belong to. So this is the first argument, the name of the action, and you usually group them in square brackets. So in this example, the action belongs to a group of books, and the action is called set books. So this is the first argument to name the action. The second argument describes the additional data that you piggyback on that action. So in this case, our set books action will get an array of string called books. So in action, usually there is a lot of time when an action needs to send additional data to the reducer to change the state. For example, if an action happens from a server query, you might want to pass along with that action the data that you got back from the server. So a lot of time actions need to send additional data for the reducer in order to change the next state. So the second argument is that data that you attach to the action. So let's start with the first exercise in this lesson, an exercise where we're going to practice the createAction API. So I'll post in the video description a link to the site with the exercise. It's in our site, Academy's EN course, Angular NGRX action. I'll post a link to it. In here you have student exercise to practice createAction. No need to open ID or start a new Angular application. You can write the code in our site. We made your life easier, so just do the exercise. It's important. This is the way you'll learn NGRX and the API and really understand how to work with NGRX. So the exercise is basically, we supplied here a basic Angular application with something called a repo service. This is a service that sends a request to grab GitHub APIs. So we are going to use this service. Also, we created a reducer. Now, the reducer is, we will have a lesson about a reducer with a coding exercise about reducers. So we're not going to focus on this, although we did talk about reducers when we talked about the NGRX data flow. So in here, the reducer is going to import an action called set repos. This is the action that you need to create in this exercise. We also have a repo type. This is the type that we are getting from this API. The repo type is just a type that contains what we are getting from the server. We are getting an array of ID of GitHub repositories containing ID, a name, and a description. In the actions file, this is the place where you need to create the action we saw in the reducer. We saw an action called set repos. You need to create that action using the createAction function from NGRX store. And that action basically needs to populate the store with a list of repos. So you will this is the action that you dispatch after you use the repo service. So we're going to use the repo service to fetch the GitHub repositories, and then we are going to dispatch this action to store those GitHub repositories in our store. Our state will look like this. We have our state in NGRX, we'll have a repos reducer, which we already created and attached. And in the repos reducer, we will have a list which is populated with the repositories that we're grabbing from our service. We see that our reducer already implemented it. So on our action set repos, we are getting the repos and we're populating the list with those repos. So the reducer is already implemented. Your part is to implement the set repos action. Now you will also need to implement the component, the app component. The app component displays the list of repos that it's grabbing, but it displays them from the store, not from the API. So you're going to need to implement the onInit, and on the onInit of this component, you will need to call the service, the repo service, the API. Then the API return, you will need to do a store dispatch with the data that you get from that API. And using the store, and then you will have to select the list of repos by creating a property called repos in your app component with using store select to select the list of books. So the list that you're displaying here of the repos are grabbed from the store. You have the solution here, but you have the solution underneath, but this is the part where you pause the video and you click the link in the description of the video and try to complete the code yourself. After you created this exercise and finished, you can play the video again, and then I will show you the full solution of this exercise. Let's go over the solution to the coding exercise. Now, the way I'm going to show you the solution, I'm going to start a new Angular from scratch. I'm not going to use the site. It is important for me that you see how also the reducer is created and the store is created. So I'm going to show the full flow of development, and then we'll go over the solution that you were supposed to enter in the site. So I'm going to show the full solution, and we'll start by creating a new Angular application. So it's npx Angular CLI latest, and we'll create a new app. We'll call it NGRX Actions Demo, and I'm going to pass the minimal flag, which means no external templates, no external styles, no test file, minimal amount of files. I'm going to say OK to proceed. At the time of this recording, we're using Angular 17. The styling is not important in this lesson. I'm going to choose CSS, and I'm not going to enable server-side rendering and static site generation. So I'm just going to click no. Let's give it a few seconds to generate our application and open that application with VS Code. So we opened our newly created project with VS Code, and let's start with creating a few types. So I'm going to the app, and I'll generate a type that represents repo. This is a type that represents a GitHub repository. And a GitHub repository in our case contains an ID, which is a number, and contains a name with a string and description, which is a string. Let's also define another type, which is what we want our state to look like. So I'm going to create a file called state, and in here I'm going to generate a type state, and our state is going to look like this. We're going to have a section called repos in our state, and repos will contain a list which is of type repo array. So we have a repo section with a list. Now let's install NGRX Store and NGRX Store DevTools. So I'm going to ng add NGRX Store latest. I'm going to confirm to install it. And I'm going to install also Store DevTools. I'm going to confirm the installation. Now let's start with creating our service. So I'm going to create a service which is going to use HTTP client to fetch GitHub repos. So to generate the service, I'm going to do npx ng generate service, and I'm going to name the name of the service repo, and I'm going to pass the flag skip tests to skip the creation of tests, and I'm going to open the repo service. Now the repo service is going to send use HTTP client to send a request to a server. So I'm going to have to inject the HTTP client. Now, if I'm injecting the HTTP client, I need to supply it, right? So if you want to supply the HTTP client everywhere in your app, you can simply go to appconfig.ts, or if you're using older Angular, just use app module in the imports. But if you're using new Angular and you like standalone components, then you can configure it in the app config. So in here, I'm going to specify that I want to use the provide HTTP client to provide HTTP client everywhere. And now I can inject the HTTP client in my repo service. Now let's add a function in my service called getRepos, which uses HTTP get and sends a request to GitHub API. Now I'm not sure about this URL, so let me go back to my site, to the Academy site, and check out the repo service and check out the URL here. And we'll just make sure it's the same URL. We'll copy this, and this will be our URL. Now it helps to say what the HTTP is returning, because Angular doesn't really know, but you can paste a generic type here and say that this returns a repo array. Great, we created our API to fetch the GitHub repository. Now let's create our reducer. So I am going to create a reducer that matches our state. So we'll have a reducer that is in charge of the repos section, and we'll name this reducer repos.reducer.ts. Now in future lessons, I'm going to talk about the NGRX schematics, which allows you to expand the Angular CLI. And this allows you to generate, using Angular CLI, generate reducer, actions, etc., stuff that relates to NGRX. So you can actually, the same way we generated a service, you can use the same way to generate a reducer if you install the NGRX schematics. So I'll talk about it in future lesson. But until we talk about it, we'll do it the harder way by coding it ourselves. So let's import from NGRX store. We create reducer. We create reducer using the create reducer function in NGRX store, and we're going to export the repos reducer which is a create reducer. The create reducer gets as first argument, it gets how it's going to initialize the part of the state that this reducer is in charge of. So this reducer will initialize the list with an empty array, and the second argument of create reducer is optional actions that this reducer respond to. We'll implement the action and then we'll populate the second part of the create reducer. For now, let's create the repos reducer and let's connect this reducer to our store. So I'm going to the app config, and in the provide store, I'm going to place my reducer. So let's import from the reducer we just created, repos reducer. I'm going to import the reducer I created, and in the provide store, create a repos section which the repo reducer is in charge of. Now, if everything goes well, I should see in the browser a state that looks like repos and an empty list. So let's see that everything is working so far. I'm going to ng serve my app and go back to the browser, go to localhost 4200, open the developer tools, and you probably already installed Redux DevTools extension, and for some reason it's showing me a different app. Okay, now it's good. So I opened the Redux DevTools extension, and I see that my state contains a section of repos with a list which is initialized by an empty array. From here, let's create the action and connect everything to our app component. Going back to our code, let's create our action. So I'm going to create a file. If I called my reducer repos reducer, let's call the repos.actions and use the NGRX store createAction to generate an action that I'll call her set repos. And the set repos will be a create action, and the first argument of create action is the name of the action, and the second argument of the create repos is additional data that we want to attach. So I'm going to name it. Remember that it's good practice to prefix the name of the action with the group that they belong to. So let's name it repos and call the action set repos. Now what I will get is I'm going to import props. We use props to add additional data to our action. And in the second argument, I'm going to say that my action has a props called repos, which is an array of repo. So I created an action called set repos, and I'm saying that my action has an additional data of the repos that I'm grabbing from the server. So now let's go back to my app component. In my app component, I am going to implement onInit and create the ng onInit function. And in here, I'm going to use the service I created, the repo service. So let's inject the repo service. And I'm going to use this repo service to call the get repos and subscribe to after I get the data back from the server. And then here I'm going to call the store dispatch, calling my action. So I need to inject the store service. So let's also inject our store, and we can say that our store contains the state as generic type, the state that we created in our type. And here, after we subscribe, I am going to call the store dispatch. And in the dispatch, I'm going to send my action. So let's call the action that we just created. And in the dispatch, I'm going to call set repos, passing the repos that we got from the server. Now, if everything goes well, I should see my store populated with the list of repos. But something that we forgot to modify the reducer as well. So the store will use the set repos and send it to a reducer. Now if we go back to our reducer, we need to say in the second argument that the reducer responds to the set repos action. So to do this, we import the on, and we use on to say that we're going to respond to the set repos. Let's import this, and we will get to the second argument is a function having the state and the action, which is repos. And now we can say that our state has a list and we populate the list with repos. Now Angular doesn't know what the array type is, so we can say as repo array, and now it's fine. So let's see that our app is working and that we're managing to populate the state with the list that we're getting from the server. So let's go back to our browser, and we see that the set repos is called and our repos is populated with different repositories. Let's go back to the IDE. Now that we have our state populated, all we need to do is read from the state. So I'm going in the template, I'm going to create a UL, an unordered list, and a list item. And I'm going to place in each list item, the list items are going to iterate on ng4, and I'm going to create repos. I'm going to read from the state the array of GitHub repositories. And the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to create a property called repos and select from the state repos list. Great. Now that we have our repos variable, we can iterate on the repos variable by saying ng4 let repo of repos. Now remember, it's an observable, so we need to read it with the async pipe. Now in each li, I'm going to display the repo name. Let's see that our app is working and displaying the list of repositories, so we see it here. So this was basically the first exercise where you needed to create a repo action called set repos that is getting the repo, and in the app component you needed to, in the ng-init, to call the store dispatch with this action. You already have the reducer and the service ready. You also needed to read from the store. So after you populated the store, you needed to read by doing a store select. You did have the template ready, but those are the parts that you needed to create in this exercise. After we did the first exercise using the createAction API to create a single action, let's go over the second function to create multiple action, a group of actions, function called createActionGroup. So usually you'll usually use this function to create multiple actions. It's much more convenient than the createAction that we covered. So you usually want to use this function because usually we'll create a group of actions. Each reducer will have more than one action, and this function will be more useful than creating just a single action. So with this, you can create multiple actions that belong to the same group. So if we have the repos group and we want to create more than just the set repos action, we can use this function to create multiple actions that belongs to the repos group. And the way it works is you import the createActionGroup, and then you provide the source. The source is a string which, if you recalled, we said that an action is usually prefixed with a square brackets in a group. So basically this is the group, the prefix of the group that those action belongs to. And the events are the actual actions. So it's the name of the actions, and it's an object with the name of the action, and the value is the props that the actions are getting, or an empty props if an action doesn't have any payload of data. So right now we'll do a student exercise practicing the API for createActionGroup. Again, you have the link to the exercise in the description of the video, and in this exercise you continue the previous exercise and you add an X button to each element of our list of GitHub repo. And when you click the X button, it will delete that GitHub repo. And basically you need to create a group of actions with action to set repos like we saw in the previous exercise, but this time you will add another action called delete repo, which will get the repo ID and then delete that repo. So our reducer now contains two on cases, one that responds to a set repos like the previous exercise, but now we have another action in the group called delete repo, which is getting the ID and is filtering the list based on that ID. And in the app component, you will create the list with a button to delete the repo, and then you create this function in our app component class, and you're going to dispatch the delete action that you created. So this is the time where you pause the video, go to our site, and try to implement the code yourself using the API for createActionGroup. Let's go back to the IDE and show the solution of the exercise to use the createActionGroup. So in this exercise, we are going to add, for each element in our repo list, we're going to add a button with X and an event attached to that button to delete repo. Now our delete repo function will get the repo ID. Oh, sorry, repo ID, like so. Now let's implement this function delete repo, which will get an ID of number, and the number represents the repo that we want to delete. And in here we are going to call the store dispatch with an action that we're going to create. So let's create those actions using the createActionGroup. So I'm going to go to my repos action file, and in here, instead of using the createAction, I am going to use the createActionGroup. And instead of doing createAction here, let's comment this. I'm going to export a variable called, we'll call it repo actions. And repo action will call createActionGroup. createActionGroup gets an object. The object gets a source, which is the name of the group. We'll name it repos. And it also can get events, which is our list of multiple actions. So we have one action that is called set repos. Let's place this, which is getting these props here, props of the list of repos that we're getting from the server. We want to add another action called delete repo, which we're going to get ID of the repo we want to delete, which is a number. Now we want our reducer to respond to the set repo and also to the delete repo. So let's go back to our reducer file, and in here we have something that responds to our set repos, but we don't have set repos like before. Instead we have a new variable called repos actions, and instead of the set repos, it's repos actions dot set repos. The second argument the second action that we want to respond to is repo action dot delete repo, and in here we are getting the state as first argument of the function, and the second argument is an action, and we can destructure the ID that we're getting with the action. Now we want to filter the list and remove any repo with this ID. So we'll create a new let's call filter repos, which is the state.list filter, and it's grabbing all the repos with ID that is not equal to this ID. And then we will return a new state, a spread of the state, because the state has to be immutable. Only the list will be the filter repos. So this will be our reducer. And it's not that important if you don't completely understand the reducer part, because we didn't have a lesson yet on reducer. We'll have a full coding exercise about creating your reducer. So don't worry about the reducer part. In fact, in this exercise, we implemented the reducer in the website. We implemented the reducer for you. So this part, you didn't have to do it yourself, but it's nice to see the solution, to see the whole flow. So I'm showing the whole flow here, so don't worry if the reducer part is not yet fully understood. So now that we created a reducer, let's go back to our app component, and now I'm going to import, instead of set repos like before, I'm going to import the repo actions and then called the repo action dot set repos as the first action when we get the list from the server, and the delete repo will be repo actions dot delete repo. Now let's go back to our browser and verify that it's working. So here is the list. We have an X mark, and we can see that we have the delete repos, and we have the set repos in the action list, and then we have a few repos that we deleted. By the way, you can time travel back if you want to undo those deletions, so you can see all those repos that we deleted, and you can move backward and forward using the Redux dev tools. And that's about it. This is the solution to the second exercise, where you need to create a group of actions, and then you can create them with the create action group, which allows you to create multiple actions that relate to the same group. So that's it. That was our coding exercise to learn the create action and create action group. Write down in the comments if you succeeded and you completed the exercise. Let's summarize this lesson with action. Basically, this is your way to tell the NGRX store that something happened in your application. It will often cause your actions are going through the reducers, and often they will cause your state to change. An action contains a string identifier. We saw that the string identifier is usually prefixed with a group. So I place the actions in a group, and I can name that group with a certain convention, like we did square brackets and then repos. And you have also optional payload in your actions. Your NGRX supplies you with two functions to create your action. One is create action, which creates a single action, but the more used a function to create an action will be the create action group, because usually we want to create more than one action in a group. We want to create many actions in a group, so we'll use probably the create action group function. That's it. Thank you for listening. Again, I remind you that all the solution and the exercises and a guide, step-by-step guide, are in our site, academies.com, EN course, Angular, NGRX actions. You have all the code, the source code, the solution in here. You like our content, don't forget to like and subscribe, and thank you for listening.